March 12, 1946. The worn town square of Würzburg, Bavaria. The fountain that had survived 1,000 years stood silent, its basin cracked from the bombing raids that had turned 80% of the city into rubble. Lieselotte Krauss, 23 years old, former secretary to a Wehrmacht logistics officer, now just another displaced woman in a defeated nation, pressed her pen against the last pages of her diary. Her hand trembled as she wrote words that seemed too incredible to be true. For 6 years we were told Americans were barbaric, that they would destroy us, humiliate us, treat us like animals. Tonight, in the ruins of our city, surrounded by the ashes of everything we knew, they did something we never expected. They asked us to dance. The music had started at 7 o'clock in the evening. Not martial music, not propaganda anthems, but something Lieselotte hadn't heard since before the war. Jazz. The forbidden music, the degenerate sound that the Reich had banned as culturally poisonous, racially impure, the soundtrack of a morally bankrupt America. Yet here it was, flowing from American speakers set up in the town square, filling the air with rhythms that made her heart beat faster despite everything she had been taught. The contrast couldn't have been sharper. Just 18 months earlier, any German woman caught listening to such music would have faced interrogation by the Gestapo. Dancing to it would have meant imprisonment. Association with those who played it could mean death. The Nazi regime had controlled every aspect of German women's lives with suffocating precision. What they wore, where they went, whom they spoke to, how they spent their evenings. Everything regulated, everything monitored, everything designed to serve the state. Lieselotte remembered the directives clearly. German women were to embody purity, discipline, sacrifice. Social dancing had been restricted to approved folk dances and carefully supervised military balls where every gesture was prescribed, every movement controlled. The regime had been particularly paranoid about women and music, seeing in unsupervised dancing a threat to racial purity and social order. Women were to be mothers and homemakers, not dancers and dreamers. Yet on this March evening in 1946, American soldiers had set up a makeshift dance floor in the square. They had hung lights, simple bulbs strung between the few buildings still standing. They had arranged chairs salvaged from bombed houses. They had even brought refreshments, real coffee and cookies that smelled like a memory from childhood. And then they had done something that shattered every assumption Lieselotte had carried through the war. They had invited the German women to join them, not as conquered people, not as servants or as spoils of war, simply as people who might enjoy an evening of music and dancing. Marguerite Hoffmann, a schoolteacher from Munich who had fled to Würzburg after her city was bombed, stood beside Lieselotte that first evening, staring at the scene with visible confusion. She would later write in a letter to her sister in Hamburg, "The psychological dissonance was overwhelming. For years, German women had been bombarded with propaganda about American degeneracy. They had been shown images of American women as frivolous, morally loose, controlled by Jewish influences. They had been told that American soldiers were brutal savages who would rape and murder German civilians without mercy. The propaganda ministry had spent years building this narrative, preparing German women to expect the worst from defeat. Instead, here were American soldiers, some barely 20 years old, setting up a dance in the ruins of a German city, offering cookies to enemy civilians, playing music, and asking politely if anyone would like to join. The first woman to step forward became legendary in the small community of survivors. Her name was Anna Weber, 58 years old, a widow whose husband had died on the Eastern Front, whose 2 sons were prisoners somewhere in Russia, whose daughter had been killed in the bombing of Dresden.
She had nothing left to lose. Anna walked slowly across the square, her worn shoes clicking on the broken cobblestones. Every eye watched her, German women holding their breath, uncertain whether to be horrified or hopeful. American soldiers waiting patiently, respectfully. The music continued, a smooth melody that seemed impossibly gentle in a world that had known only violence for so long. An American sergeant, tall and young with kind eyes, stepped forward. He was perhaps 22, from somewhere in America that Anna would never see. He smiled, extended his hand, and asked in careful, practiced German, "Would you like to dance, ma'am?" Ma'am. Not Fraulein with contempt, not woman with possession. Ma'am with respect. Anna took his hand, and they danced. Lieselot would write that night, "When I saw Anna dancing with that American boy, something inside me broke. Not broke like destruction, but broke like a dam, releasing water that had been held back too long. I realized I had been holding my breath for 6 years. We all had. And suddenly, impossibly, we were being given permission to breathe again." The psychological impact of that first dance rippled through the community of German women like shockwaves. Everything they had been taught, everything they had believed about their enemies and themselves was suddenly called into question by this simple act of humanity. Under Nazi rule, dancing had become another tool of control. The regime dictated when, where, and how German women could dance. Social gatherings were monitored by the Gestapo. Women who appeared too free, too joyful, too expressive risked being labeled as politically unreliable or morally suspect. The famous ballroom culture of Weimar Germany had been crushed, replaced by rigid folk dancing that emphasized collective identity over individual expression. Inga Schroeder, a former nurse who had served in a field hospital until the collapse, remembered those years with bitter clarity. In a memoir written decades later, she recalled, "We learned to make ourselves small, to speak quietly, move carefully, express nothing that might be noticed. The regime wanted us to be invisible unless we were serving the state. Dancing, real dancing, where your body moved freely and your spirit lifted, that was forbidden, that was dangerous. That was everything the regime feared because it reminded us we were individuals, not just tools." Yet here, in March 1946, with Germany divided and occupied, with cities in ruins and millions dead, American soldiers were creating spaces where German women could dance freely. The event spread quickly. What began in Würzburg was repeated in dozens of towns and cities across the American occupation zone. In Frankfurt, in Stuttgart, in Munich, in Nuremberg, American soldiers organized dances, concerts, and social gatherings. They brought music, lights, refreshments, and something even more valuable, the assumption that German women were human beings who deserved dignity and joy, despite everything that had happened.
Greta Zimmermann, 29 years old, a widow from Heidelberg whose husband had died at Stalingrad, attended her first American dance in April 1946. Her description, recorded in a diary discovered by her granddaughter in 1998, captured the surreal nature of the experience. "I wore the only dress I had left, a blue cotton dress that I had repaired so many times the seams were more thread than fabric. My shoes were worn through at the heels. My hair was clean but unstyled because we had no mirrors, no combs beyond what we could salvage from the ruins. I felt like a ghost of the woman I had been before the war. Yet when I arrived at the dance hall, the American soldier at the door smiled at me like I was beautiful, not with hunger or contempt, but with genuine warmth. 'Welcome,' he said in broken German. 'We are happy you came.'" The contrast with their previous lives was devastating in its completeness. Under Nazi rule, German women had been valued only for their utility to the state. Their worth was measured in children born, in sacrifices made, in suffering endured without complaint. The regime had stripped away their individuality, their autonomy, their right to simple pleasures. The Hitler Youth programs for girls had emphasized discipline, obedience, and preparation for motherhood. The League of German Girls taught domestic skills and racial ideology, not self-expression or joy. Social activities were carefully controlled, designed to reinforce Nazi values rather than allow genuine human connection. Dancing, when permitted at all, was regimented. Partners were assigned, steps were prescribed. The goal was collective coordination, not individual freedom. Women who danced too freely, who showed too much personality or spontaneity, risked being reported as politically unreliable. Helena Müller, a former factory worker from Stuttgart, remembered the stark difference in a 1987 interview. At Nazi dances, you felt watched. Every movement was judged. Were you displaying proper German character? Were you too friendly with men? Too reserved? Too loud? Too quiet? You couldn't relax because you knew someone was always monitoring, always ready to report deviation. But at the American dances, no one was watching to judge. They were watching because they wanted to see people having fun. The music itself was revolutionary. Jazz, swing, big band sounds that had been forbidden throughout the Nazi years as racially impure and culturally degenerate. The regime had banned American music, along with American films, American literature, anything that might contaminate German racial purity with foreign influences. Yet here was that forbidden music, played openly by American soldiers who seemed to take genuine joy in sharing it. The rhythms were complex.
Lieselot Krauss, attending her third American dance in April 1946, wrote, "The music moved through me in ways I had forgotten were possible. My body remembered how to respond to rhythm, how to move without thinking, how to express what I felt without words. For 6 years we had been taught to suppress such responses. Spontaneity was dangerous. Joy was suspicious. But the music didn't care about ideology. It just invited you to move, to feel, to be alive in your body for a few precious hours." The American soldiers themselves proved even more surprising than the music. German women had been prepared for brutality, for exploitation, for the treatment that conquering armies had historically shown defeated populations. The propaganda had been explicit about what to expect from American occupiers. Instead, they encountered young men who seemed genuinely interested in treating them with respect. Martha Vogel, a secretary from Bremen who had relocated to Bavaria, described her first conversation with an American soldier at a dance in May 1946. His name was Robert, from a place called Iowa that I had never heard of. He asked me to dance, and when I hesitated, he said, "Only if you want to. No pressure." No pressure. Those words were so foreign to my experience. Everything in Nazi Germany had been pressure, coercion, obligation. But this American boy was offering choice. They danced, and Robert talked about his home, his family, his hopes to return to farming after his military service ended. He asked Martha about her life, her family, what she hoped to do now that the war was over. He listened to her answers with genuine attention, not the perfunctory interest of someone going through the motions. "He treated me like a person," Martha would write later, "not a German person or an enemy person or a woman who needed to be managed. Just a person. After years of being categorized, regulated, reduced to my function in the state, this simple act of being seen as an individual felt like being given back my humanity." The American approach to social interaction revealed profound cultural differences that German women had never understood. In Nazi Germany, social gatherings served ideological purposes. They reinforced hierarchy, demonstrated loyalty, maintained control. Pleasure was always secondary to purpose. But the American dances seemed to exist simply for enjoyment. There was no political indoctrination, no loyalty oaths, no racial ideology, just music, dancing, conversation, and the assumption that people deserved moments of happiness even in difficult times. Frida Hartmann, a young woman of 19 who had spent the final years of the war working in a munitions factory, found this cultural difference almost impossible to process. In a letter to her aunt in Berlin, she wrote, "The Americans organize these dances like they're the most natural thing in the world. They don't lecture us about democracy or make us feel grateful. They just play music and invite us to join. It's as if they believe we deserve this simply because we're human beings." This concept, that people deserve joy without having to earn it through service to the state, is revolutionary. The transformation in German women's self-perception came gradually but profoundly. Years of Nazi propaganda had taught them to see themselves through the regime's narrow lens. They were mothers or potential mothers, servants of the state, vessels for racial purity. Their value was external, measured by their utility to the collective. The American dances suggested something radically different, that women had intrinsic worth as individuals, that they deserved pleasure, freedom of expression, and respect regardless of their function in society. Elsa Becker, a former teacher who had lost her position for insufficient enthusiasm for Nazi ideology, attended dances throughout the summer of 1946. Her diary entries trace a remarkable psychological journey. In April, she wrote, "I attend these dances with suspicion, certain there must be an ulterior motive. No occupying force offers kindness without expecting something in return." By July, her tone had shifted. "I realize the Americans genuinely enjoy seeing us happy. It's not strategy or manipulation. They seem to believe that people should have opportunities for joy, even former enemies. This generosity of spirit is foreign to everything I learned under Nazi rule." By September, she had reached a conclusion that would shape her post-war life. "I understand now that the Americans are showing us what they fought for, not conquest or revenge, but the belief that all people deserve dignity, freedom, and the chance to flourish. They're teaching us through example, not lectures, and I'm learning." The clothing became another site of transformation. Under Nazi rule, women's fashion had been regulated to emphasize modesty, practicality, and conformity. Bright colors, bold patterns, anything that drew attention was discouraged. The regime wanted women to be uniform, interchangeable, modest vessels of racial purity. But at the American dances, women began to experiment with self-expression through dress. With fabric scarce and resources limited, they improvised creatively. Dresses were remade from curtains, skirts fashioned from military blankets, accessories crafted from wire and scavenged materials.
Renate Schmidt, a seamstress who had somehow kept her sewing machine through the war, became a legend in her community by creating dresses for women attending the dances. She would remember decades later, "Women came to me with nothing but hope and scraps of fabric. They wanted to feel beautiful again, not for men or for society, but for themselves. I made dresses from parachute silk, from flour sacks, from anything we could find. And when they put on those dresses and looked at themselves in the broken mirrors we had salvaged, I saw something return to their eyes. Pride. Not the false pride of Nazi ideology, but genuine self-respect." The Americans noticed and encouraged this self-expression. Soldiers complimented women on their dresses, not with predatory interest, but with genuine appreciation for their creativity and effort. They brought small gifts, ribbons, hair clips, costume jewelry.
Little things that seemed trivial but carried enormous symbolic weight. Anna Weber, the first woman to dance in Würzburg, received a blue hair ribbon from an American soldier in June 1946. She wore it to every dance thereafter until her death in 1973. Her daughter found it among her possessions with a note. "This ribbon was the first beautiful thing given to me in friendship, not obligation, after the war. It reminded me that beauty still existed in the world, and that I was worthy of receiving it." The interactions between American soldiers and German women challenged every stereotype both groups had held. German women had expected brutality or exploitation. They found respect and genuine interest. American soldiers had been warned about fraternization dangers and taught to see Germans as the enemy. Yet at the dances, they discovered young women who were tired, scared, and trying to rebuild lives from nothing. Letters home from American soldiers reveal their own transformation. Private James Morrison from Ohio wrote to his mother in May 1946, "We organized a dance tonight in a bombed-out hall. The German girls came wearing dresses made from flour sacks and curtains, their shoes held together with string, but they carried themselves with such dignity. They're not the enemy anymore, Ma. They're just kids like us who got caught up in something terrible. Dancing with them feels like we're building peace, one dance at a time." The food at these dances provided another revelation. American soldiers brought refreshments that German women hadn't seen in years. Real coffee, not the ersatz substitute made from chicory and acorns. Cookies made with real sugar and butter. Sometimes chocolate, that legendary substance that had become mythical during the war years.
Gisela Frank, who attended dances in Munich throughout 1946, remembered the first time she tasted real American chocolate. "An American soldier offered me a chocolate bar with such casual generosity, as if it were nothing special. I hadn't tasted chocolate in 4 years. When I bit into it, I started crying. Not delicate tears, but sobbing that I couldn't control. The soldier looked horrified, thinking he had done something wrong, but I couldn't explain that I was crying because something so simple, so sweet, so unnecessary for survival existed in the world again. It meant that beauty and pleasure weren't gone forever." The American abundance, even in small gestures, contrasted starkly with German scarcity. While German women were counting calories and stretching rations, American soldiers gave away candy and cigarettes without thought. This casual generosity demonstrated the vast gulf between the two nations' resources, but it also revealed something about American character that German propaganda had never captured. "They shared without calculating," Lieselot wrote in July 1946. "Not to show superiority or to humiliate us with their abundance, but because sharing was natural to them. They seemed genuinely uncomfortable keeping plenty while others had nothing. This instinct toward generosity was incomprehensible to minds shaped by Nazi ideology about racial competition and survival of the fittest." The conversations at the dances became as important as the dancing itself. German women, many of whom had never spoken with foreigners before, found themselves in dialogue with Americans from places they could barely imagine. Farm boys from Iowa and Kansas, factory workers from Detroit and Pittsburgh, students from California and Texas. These Americans talked about home with a nostalgia and openness that surprised their German listeners. They showed photographs of families, farms, towns that looked nothing like the bombed ruins of Germany. They spoke about returning to normal life, to jobs and education and futures they took for granted. Hildegard Koch, a young woman from Hamburg who had fled to Bavaria, remembered a conversation that changed her perspective. "I danced with a soldier named David from somewhere called Wisconsin. He told me about his farm, about cows and corn, and a life that seemed impossibly peaceful. When I asked what he would do after the army, he said he would go to university on something called the GI Bill. The government would pay for his education. I couldn't understand this. In Germany, university was for the elite, for those with connections or money. But David, a farmer's son, just assumed he would go to university because he had served his country. This casual expectation of opportunity, this belief that service should be rewarded with education, revealed a society I had never imagined. The music selections at the dances reflected American cultural confidence. Glenn Miller, Benny Goodman, Duke Ellington, Count Basie. The very names had been forbidden during Nazi rule, condemned as examples of racial degeneracy and cultural corruption. Yet here was this music, complex and sophisticated, played by talented musicians, revealing the lie behind Nazi propaganda about American cultural.
Some German women who had secretly listened to forbidden radio broadcasts during the war recognized the songs. They had risked severe punishment to hear this music, drawn to its vitality and freedom despite the danger. Now they could dance to it openly, without fear. Maria Schneider, who had been a music student before the war, found the experience overwhelming. I had studied classical music, been taught that German composers represented the pinnacle of Western civilization. Then I heard these American jazz musicians, and I understood that great art comes from freedom, not from state control. The improvisation, the individual expression within collective harmony, the joy in the music itself rather than service to ideology, it was everything our music had lost under the Nazis. As spring turned to summer in 1946, the dances became regular events in the American occupation zone. Weekly dances in larger cities, monthly events in smaller towns. They created a routine, something to look forward to, a structure for hope in otherwise chaotic times. The psychological impact deepened with each event. German women who initially attended with suspicion and fear gradually relaxed. They laughed more freely. They engaged in conversations that ranged beyond survival topics. They began to remember what it felt like to be young, to have fun, to imagine futures beyond mere existence. Elizabeth Werner, a widow with 2 young children, initially refused to attend any dances. It felt like betrayal, she would later explain. My husband was dead, my city destroyed, my country defeated. How could I dance? But her friend Gerda convinced her to attend just once, in August 1946. I watched the women dancing, Elizabeth remembered, and I realized they weren't betraying anything. They were choosing to live. After years of death and destruction, they were asserting their right to joy. That night, I danced for the first time since 1942. And when I danced, I felt my husband's memory living in me rather than crushing me. He would have wanted me to live. The American soldiers rotated home as occupation duty ended, but new soldiers arrived and the dances continued. Each group of Americans seemed to bring the same fundamental approach: respect, friendliness, and the assumption that social interaction should be pleasant rather than political. Some German women developed friendships with American soldiers that lasted beyond occupation. This revelation was particularly powerful for younger women who had come of age entirely under Nazi rule. They had never known a society that trusted people with freedom. The American assumption that people should be allowed to dance, socialize, and enjoy themselves without state monitoring seemed almost incomprehensibly generous. Brigitte Hoffmann, 18 in 1946, wrote to a friend, "At these dances, no one asks for your papers, your party membership, your racial background, your political beliefs. You just come and dance. This simple freedom feels like flying after years in a cage." The contrast with Soviet-occupied East Germany made the American approach even more striking. Women who had family in the Soviet zone heard stories of harsh treatment, confiscated property, and continued restrictions on freedom.
The American zone, by comparison, offered a glimpse of a different kind of society. We were lucky, many women would say in later years, acknowledging that their experience under American occupation was remarkably benign compared to what could have been. The dances symbolized this good fortune, representing American values of individual freedom and human dignity in action. By 1947, as Germany began the long process of reconstruction, the impact of these social gatherings became clear. A generation of German women had experienced, perhaps for the first time in their lives, what it felt like to be treated as individuals with inherent worth rather than as tools of the state. Many of these women would become leaders in post-war German society. Teachers, politicians, business owners, community organizers. They brought with them memories of American respect and freedom that shaped their approach to building a new Germany. Lieselotte Krause, who had written that first diary entry in March 1946, became a teacher in Würzburg. She made it her mission to teach her students about individual dignity, human rights, and the importance of freedom. In her final diary entry about the dances, written in December 1947, she reflected on what the experience had meant. We were defeated, occupied, reduced to nothing by our own leaders' mad ambitions. We expected punishment, humiliation, the treatment that victors have historically shown the vanquished. Instead, the Americans offered us music and asked us to dance. This simple act of humanity, this assumption that we deserve joy despite everything, taught us more about democracy than any lecture could have. They showed us that strength can be gentle, that power can be generous, that victors can choose mercy. These lessons shaped everything that came after. The dances continued through 1948 and beyond, gradually evolving as Germany stabilized and began its economic recovery. They became less about occupiers and occupied, more about young people from different cultures meeting and sharing experiences. The music changed, reflecting new American trends.
The conversations became more equal as German women regained confidence and stability. But those early dances, in the spring and summer of 1946, when everything was still uncertain and Germany's future remained unclear, those held special significance. They represented the moment when defeated German women discovered that their enemies were capable of extraordinary humanity. They marked the beginning of transformation, not through force or propaganda, but through the simple power of treating people with dignity. Anna Weber, who had been the first to dance that evening in Würzburg, lived until 1973. She attended dances into her 60s, always remembering that first terrifying and liberating moment when she accepted an American soldier's invitation. In a letter to a friend written shortly before her death, she summed up what it had meant. I was 58 years old when I first danced with an American soldier. I had lost everything: my husband, my son's location unknown, my daughter dead, my city in ruins, my country defeated and divided. I had no reason to hope for anything but survival. Then a young American boy asked me to dance, and in that moment I understood that the world could be rebuilt on foundations of respect and kindness rather than domination and fear. That dance gave me back my humanity. It gave me back my future. It gave me back the possibility of joy. Everything good that came after in my life and in Germany's life began that evening when we discovered that our enemies could see us as human beings worthy of dignity. We had expected punishment. They offered music. We expected humiliation. They offered respect. We expected defeat to be the end of our stories. They showed us it could be a beginning. For this gift, I remain grateful every day of my life. The story of those dances, of German women discovering freedom through music and social interaction with their American occupiers, represents one of history's more remarkable transformations. It proves that cultural change can happen through small gestures that honor human dignity. The Americans who organized these dances probably never realized the profound impact they were having. They were just offering music, refreshments, and respectful company to people who had been through hell. But in doing so, they demonstrated the power of their values more effectively than any propaganda campaign could have achieved. They showed that democracy wasn't just a political system, but a way of treating people. They proved that freedom meant trusting individuals to make choices about their own lives. They taught that strength could be gentle and that victors could afford generosity. The German women who attended those dances carried these lessons into the post-war world. They raised children who grew up in democratic West Germany, teaching them that individual dignity matters, that freedom is precious, that cultural exchange enriches rather than threatens. They built businesses, schools, and communities that reflected values learned on dance floors in bombed cities. When the Berlin Wall fell in 1989, many of these women, now elderly, watched with tears as Germany reunited under democratic principles. They remembered those first uncertain days of peace when American soldiers invited them to dance, and in doing so, offered them a future worth building.
The German women who danced in those ruined cities in 1946 discovered this truth firsthand. They had expected punishment, but found humanity. They had anticipated humiliation, but experienced respect. They had prepared for continued suffering, but were offered, simply and generously, an invitation to dance. In accepting that invitation, they took the first steps toward a future none of them could have imagined during the dark years of Nazi rule. A future built on freedom, dignity, and the revolutionary idea that all people deserve the chance to flourish, to express themselves, to dance freely without fear. That was the gift the Americans offered on those makeshift dance floors. Not just music and movement, but hope. Hope that the world could be rebuilt on better principles. Hope that enemies could become friends. Hope that even in the darkest moments, humanity could prevail. The women who experienced this transformation never forgot it. They told their children and grandchildren about the evenings when American soldiers asked them to dance, treating them not as defeated enemies, but as human beings worthy of respect. These stories shaped generations, teaching that peace requires not just the absence of war, but the presence of dignity. That reconciliation comes through recognition of shared humanity, and that sometimes the most powerful weapon is a simple act of kindness. The dances in occupied Germany demonstrated a truth that military conquest alone could never achieve. That the best way to defeat an ideology of hatred and domination is to offer its victims an experience of freedom and respect. The German women who accepted invitations to dance in the spring of 1946 didn't just step onto dance floors, they stepped into a new world, one where their value as individuals was recognized and celebrated, where their choices mattered, where they could experience joy without having to earn it through service to the state. This was democracy in action, not as a political theory, but as a lived reality. And it changed everything.